In a quiet suburban neighborhood, the homes were nearly identical manicured lawns, white fences, and flower beds arranged in neat, predictable rows. It was the kind of place where everything looked perfect on the surface, but beneath the clean image, tension simmered like an unseen storm. The source of this tension was not the families who lived there, but the woman who ruled over them, the HOA board president. She was known by every resident, not because she was friendly or approachable, but because her presence carried an authority no one dared to challenge. With her clipboard and ever-watchful eyes, she inspected the community daily, searching for the smallest infraction to record. If a trash bin was left visible for a moment too long, it was noted. If grass grew a fraction taller than the HOA handbook allowed, it was fined. Even seasonal decorations were timed and measured, with penalties imposed on anyone who dared to enjoy their holidays a little too early or too late. Over time, her strictness became less about maintaining property values and more about control. She relished the power of sending letters and slapping fines on her neighbors, watching them scramble to comply. The community meetings were dominated by her presence, as she silenced any opposition and reminded everyone that the rules existed for a reason. She claimed fairness, but her actions showed a hunger for authority that went far beyond neighborhood order. The residents whispered behind closed doors, grumbling about her tyranny, yet no one dared to confront her directly. Many had tried in the past, only to be met with harsher enforcement afterward. It was easier, most thought, to endure the fines and keep their frustrations quiet. After all, how much trouble could one woman truly cause? But as time went on, her demands became more outrageous, and her punishments more severe. One summer, she began fining families for minor things like mismatched flower colors or small cracks in the driveway. She even sent a warning to a family whose child's bicycle was left leaning against the garage for an afternoon, calling it an eyesore. Parents, already burdened with daily life, now lived in fear of simple mistakes costing them money. The neighborhood that once felt like a community of families began to feel like a prison overseen by a warden. People stopped gathering for block parties, wary that any gathering might be policed for noise or unauthorized decorations. Children played less in front yards, while parents became anxious about even leaving lawn chairs outside. Still, the board president thrived on the atmosphere of obedience. To her, it was proof of her effectiveness. She prided herself on what she called the cleanest neighborhood in the county. Yet beneath her satisfaction, resentment brewed. It was inevitable that cracks would form in her perfect system. And when they did, the very rules she weaponized against her neighbors would come back to haunt her. The first sign appeared subtly, almost unnoticeably. Her own front yard, always pristine, began to show neglect. A few weeds pushed through the carefully maintained flower beds. Her trash bin sat outside a little too long one evening, overlooked perhaps in her haste to write another violation notice for someone else. No one said anything at first, but everyone noticed. The irony was not lost on them. The woman who punished them mercilessly for such offenses now stood guilty of the same. And as the weeks went on, her slip-ups grew more frequent, more visible, and more damning. The neighbors waited, their frustration transforming into quiet anticipation. For years, they had lived under her rule, but now they sensed the balance of power beginning to shift. They knew that soon, she would be caught in her own web of rules. The stage was set, and what began as murmurs of discontent was about to grow into something much larger, a rebellion carefully fueled by the very standards she had enforced so ruthlessly. The community would not have to wait long for their chance.
The president's authority was built on the illusion of perfection, an untouchable image that kept the residents in line. But as weeks passed, small signs of imperfection began appearing around her own home. The weeds in her flower beds spread a little further, the once perfectly trimmed bushes grew uneven, and the edges of her lawn started to brown from neglect. She still carried her clipboard, issuing warnings and fines to neighbors, yet her hypocrisy became harder to ignore. It started as whispers during school drop-offs and late evening walks. "Did you see her trash bins?" one would murmur. "She fined me last month for the same thing." The irony was delicious, but the residents held back, unsure if pointing out her faults would make them her next target. Then one day she received a delivery, a large package that sat on her porch for days. According to her own rules, packages must not remain outside for more than 24 hours. Every homeowner in the neighborhood had been fined for this violation at least once. And yet there it was, her own parcel, untouched and collecting dust. The site became a silent spark for the neighborhood. Neighbors began snapping photos, quietly collecting evidence of her growing negligence. What had once been fear now turned into cautious amusement. Each time she patrolled with her clipboard, residents peered from their windows knowing they had proof of her hypocrisy tucked away. The turning point came when her car, usually spotless, was parked along the street overnight. She had fined countless residents for doing the same, claiming it disrupted the neighborhood's harmony. But there her car sat, in plain violation of her own rules. The whispers turned to plans. The community had endured her tyranny for too long. They began meeting in secret, families gathering in garages, backyards, and living rooms. Photos of her violations were shared, stories were compared, and a strategy began forming. If she could find them for every small mistake, then surely she could not escape the same treatment. It wasn't just revenge anymore. It was justice. And for the first time in years, the residents felt united, not under her rule, but against it. As the summer heat bore down and her yard grew more neglected, the neighborhood's patience reached its breaking point. The community prepared for the moment when they would confront her with the truth, and she would finally experience the weight of her own rules. The rebellion was no longer a dream, it was inevitable. The president's authority was built on the illusion of perfection, an untouchable image that kept the residents in line. But as weeks passed, small signs of imperfection began appearing around her own home. The weeds in her flower beds spread a little further, the once perfectly trimmed bushes grew uneven, and the edges of her lawn started to brown from neglect. She still carried her clipboard, issuing warnings and fines to neighbors, yet her hypocrisy became harder to ignore. It started as whispers during school drop-offs and late evening walks. "Did you see her trash bins?" one would murmur. "She fined me last month for the same thing." The irony was delicious, but the residents held back, unsure if pointing out her faults would make them her next target. Then one day she received a delivery, a large package that sat on her porch for days. According to her own rules, packages must not remain outside for more than 24 hours. Every homeowner in the neighborhood had been fined for this violation at least once. And yet, there it was, her own parcel, untouched and collecting dust. The site became a silent spark for the neighborhood. Neighbors began snapping photos, quietly collecting evidence of her growing negligence. What had once been fear now turned into cautious amusement. Each time she patrolled with her clipboard, residents peered from their windows, knowing they had proof of her hypocrisy tucked away. The turning point came when her car, usually spotless, was parked along the street overnight. She had fined countless residents for doing the same, claiming it disrupted the neighborhood's harmony. But there her car sat, in plain violation of her own rules. The whispers turned to plans. The community had endured her tyranny for too long. They began meeting in secret, families gathering in garages, backyards, and living rooms. Photos of her violations were shared, stories were compared, and a strategy began forming. If she could find them for every small mistake, then surely she could not escape the same treatment. It wasn't just revenge anymore. It was justice. And for the first time in years, the residents felt united, not under her rule, but against it. As the summer heat bore down and her yard grew more neglected, the neighborhood's patience reached its breaking point. The community prepared for the moment when they would confront her with the truth, and she would finally experience the weight of her own rules. The rebellion was no longer a dream, it was inevitable. The HOA meeting began like all the others. The president sat at the front, clipboard in hand, her voice sharp as she read off a list of new fines and regulations. Families shifted uncomfortably in their seats, as they always had. But tonight, something was different. Instead of silence, the residents listened with a calm determination. When she paused to demand compliance, one homeowner raised their hand. "Madam President," they said evenly, "we've noticed some violations in your own property." Her face stiffened. She laughed it off, trying to dismiss the comment, but then came the evidence. One by one, neighbors pulled out photographs, violation notices drafted in her own style, and records of her repeated negligence. The room buzzed with murmurs as photo after photo was laid on the table. The president's composure cracked. She tried to silence them, insisting she was exempt, but her own handbook proved otherwise. Her power unraveled before her eyes. For years, she had relied on intimidation and fear to control the community, but now the community stood united, stronger than her authority. As the evidence piled higher, her excuses grew weaker. The room that once echoed with her voice now rang with the voices of those she had silenced for too long. The tide had turned, and she knew it. The once powerful president struggled to maintain authority, but her words fell flat. The residents she had belittled and fined now stood against her in solidarity. Every attempt she made to reclaim control was met with facts, photographs, and her own rules thrown back at her. Her greatest weapon, the HOA handbook, had become her downfall. The same rigid rules she used to punish others now shackled her. For the first time, she realized the isolation she had created. No one defended her. No one sympathized. Her years of cruelty had left her utterly alone. The board, sensing the shift in power, turned their backs as well. What once was her domain now became her undoing. One by one, the residents called for her resignation. The walls of authority she had built around herself crumbled. Her clipboard, once a symbol of fear, lay abandoned on the table. And in that moment, she understood what the neighborhood had known all along. Power built on fear could never last. The community had reclaimed their voice. Her resignation was swift. Within weeks, a new president was elected, someone chosen not for their hunger for power, but for their willingness to listen. The community meetings transformed from dreaded gatherings to hopeful discussions. Families spoke freely, children laughed outside again, and the neighborhood began to heal. The former president, stripped of her authority, retreated into silence. Her house, once the symbol of strict order, now stood as a reminder of her downfall. Neighbors passed by without fear, only relief that her reign was over. The community thrived, no longer shackled by unfair fines and constant surveillance. Block parties returned, decorations filled the streets during holidays, and families once again felt at home. In the end, the residents learned an important lesson. Unity was stronger than fear. The power-hungry president had built her rule on control, but the community had taken it back with solidarity. Justice had been served, and the neighborhood, once trapped in her shadow, finally stepped into the